So much for having me again. And yeah, thank you for everyone who's showed up. I really appreciate that you tune into my talk, and I hope that it will be valuable for all of you. So, am I good to go?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, before we kick off, I just want to say thank you to the Vertical Crypto team for inviting me. I really appreciate it, and it's very nice to be able to share a little bit of my thinking behind curation, which is also why I am here to talk today. But before I go into that, I just want to take some time and present myself as well. I am Stina Gustaffson. I am an independent curator and art strategist, and I'm currently based in Copenhagen. I studied culture, criticism, and curation, arts and design at Central St. Martin's in London, where I also majored in flux and future thinking in public art practices. In 2018, I started to work with what was to become Department of Decentralization, which is a Berlin-based blockchain foundation. And in 2019, I co-founded their art department, which I now also run. We very much exist within the intersection of art and tech. We say that we actually speak both languages, which means that we speak a language that is more suitable for a traditional art world, but also a language that is very much suited for tech-heavy audiences. And that's because we have both sides. So you have someone like me who comes from an art background, a more traditional art background, but we also have developers who comes very much more from a blockchain background. So we have the capability of speaking with both sides. We have released 2 full-length reports on the topic of art and blockchain. The first one was released in June 2019, so quite early, and it was called "There is no such thing as blockchain art." And it covered the intersection of blockchain art back in 2019. And I mean, a lot of it has changed since then. But this report has also been referred to as one of 2 key publications exploring blockchain's possibilities and limitations across varied cultural domains. The second one was released in February 2021, and it was called Wander Above a Sea of FUD, Cultural Workforce, Crypto-Anarchism, Intellectual Rights, and Blockchain-Based Funding Models for Culture and Arts. So a nice and short and simple title, as you see. So yeah, the second one was quite a lot narrower than the first one. And both these reports has been extremely great for us because we've been able to have great conversations with both the art world and artists such as Hitor Steril and the Bundeskunsthalle, which is the German state collection, but also with a lot of developers who are working in the space and thinking about how their knowledge can be shared with the wider cultural workforce. But I also curate, of course, because I am a curator, as I mentioned. Last year, I curated an exhibition that was called Continuous Shift for a small contemporary art center in Sweden, in Kristianstad. They wanted to take a closer look at how technology is affecting the wider art sector, and they invited me as an external curator to work with them on this specific exhibition. We had 6 artworks by 6 artists in total. We included Web3 darlings, such as Jonas Lund, that you can see here on the left, and Sarah Friend on the right. For Jonas, we exhibited a few different works, quite a few videos, but also the blue and red wall painting that you can see in the photo. It was a decision that was voted on by his board, which is how Jonas runs his art practice as well. And the wall painting was actually done by the museum staff. So we actually invited everyone who's working at the museum to come and create this beautiful, gigantic wall painting that was absolutely great to create. And for Sarah, we exhibited Life Forms, which is one of her more famous NFT works. But we also included artists that are not part of the Web3 or crypto community, but are, of course, still very much working with digital technologies. We had an installation by the artist Jo Marie Munk and Stina Gustaffson, the one here that you can see with a gigantic yellow face and hand. It's called Divine Desires, and it's thinking about endless scrolling and what technology, like if technology is the new divine force that we have in society. And then we also had Avida Byström and her piece, A Doll's House. The exhibition was also a symposium in March this year, and it's also going to be an e-publication that is launched in May. I also do my own research around locational identity in public art online. I haven't left that subject because I think it's extremely complex, and it becomes more complex as we move online. But I also research new technologies and how they might aid and benefit the wider art ecosystem, meaning the recognition of the complex and rhizomatic system that makes the art ecosystem to what it is. Absolutely amazing. But I'm not here to speak about myself, but I'm actually here to speak about curation and what that might mean when it comes to Web3, crypto, blockchain, etc., and how we might think about it as we move forward in the space. But before we go into that, I think it's also very important to look at where curation comes from, the meaning of the word, the role of the curator from a more traditional approach, to learn and reflect upon what it might mean in our sector. The word curation comes from the Latin word cura, which is directly translated to care and concern, which of course is very important for a curator. It's also the name of the Roman goddess who created the first human. Cura is first mentioned in Hyginus' work Fabula, poem 220. And this poem was picked up by the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. And when he read it, he stated that the double sense of cura refers to the care for something as concern, observation in the world, but also care in the sense of devotion. And I think this is actually a really interesting quote when I think about curation as a whole and what curation might mean, because it's really something that depends on what he mentions here: concern, observation, and devotion. Move forward to the 1960s, when the more modern idea of the role of the curator was starting to shape up. We have a few very prominent curators back then who I believe helped to shape the role a bit more to what it is today. Clement Greenberg is just one of them that I think is very important to mention in this when it comes to this. So around this time, the scope of the role widened. Care and concern was, of course, still a part, and still is, but the role of the curator became also about translation, conceptualization, ideation, recognition, interpretation, education, and valuation, etc. So the role almost became a little bit less hands-on in terms of actually caring for the works per se, in making sure it's okay, and more conceptual. And for me, it's also very much about understanding why and how. And not only why and how an art piece is made, but also how it fits within the current situation, why it might be important for the future, why it might be important from an educational point of view, how and why it's pushing the narrative forward, how it might reflect upon history, and also how it might fit within history. How it might end up helping others within the practices, and how it might change and challenge current views. Just to mention a few things that I actually consider when I speak to artists. And though, of course, skill is super important, but also for me the concept is equally as important, because you also need, or I think that art pieces also need some kind of a depth to it, which is also why is very important for me in this sense. So Web3 curation then, what is that? And is it actually any different from what you say, what you mean when you say curation in a more traditional sense? So before we jump into that, I just want to clarify a little bit what I mean when I talk about Web3, which is the latest iteration of the internet, which you probably already know. So basically, internet started with Web 1. The internet we have right now, which we are very used to using, is Web 2. It's big tech. It's the big fives: Google, Amazon, Apple, Meta, and Microsoft. So it's basically centralized internet. And what we kind of see as next is Web3, which is what I work on to a certain extent. This is the next and new iteration of the internet, so to say. And if everything goes to plan, it will also be decentralized. But I guess we have to wait and see what happens there. So what this means is that it won't be any few big companies that owns it, but it will be more distributed and more shared ownership. And as I said, I know that you've already gone through this, but it's just better to be clear so that you all know what I refer to. So when you say Web3 curation, you kind of very quickly jump into decentralized curation. It is, of course, this, but I also think that it's so much more than decentralized curation. I've gone through several processes of decentralized curation. To be completely frank, I don't really find it easy. I find this extremely hard. It usually means that kind of previous expertise, knowledge, research, it's not always recognized because you're supposed to be on the same level. And of course, no to very little hierarchy is usually great. I'm Scandinavian, so I'm all for this. Like, I'm all for we're all on the same level. But it's also, when it comes to certain extensions, it's hard because it also means that previous skills is written off as something less important because we are just supposed to be, or we are just all supposed to have an equal say. So besides decentralized curation, what do I actually mean then when I say Web3 curation, curation of crypto, curation of NFTs, or curation just in general, actually, which I think is more relevant than anything else here? I think as we move forward with the role of the curator in Web3 and these areas, there are a few certain areas which are becoming more and more important, and they are reflection, long-term thinking, and preservation. So reflection and long-term thinking, to start off, I think that these two terms goes hand in hand, and I think they are actually extremely important and are not going to get any less important as we move forward with an existence online. And what I mean with this is that we need to reflect on history to be able to implement long-term thinking for more sustainable and thoughtful future. So basically, look back to move forward, so to say. Web3 is quite quick with claiming that what's currently being created is better than what we've had so far and even what we have now. And I think it's perfectly fine to claim something like this if you know the history and are able to reflect upon previous mistakes, learnings, failures, wins, systems, etc. But if you are not able to do this, I also think it's very hard to claim that what's being created is actually better. Because you simply can't compare it to history. You might end up recreating what we've had before. And this is also for me where the curator comes in as maybe someone that can guide in terms of previous art worlds and systems, as someone that can reflect upon what it means to create systems that might be better for not only the artist, but also for the bigger art ecosystem. And this, of course, ties directly into long-term thinking and planning for something bigger in the future. If you know history, then perhaps it's easier for you to take this into consideration when it comes to thinking about strategies for more sustainable systems. And again, when I talk about this, I'm talking about the wider art ecosystem, something that goes beyond the artist and the creator and considers the whole wide cultural workforce, because I think we need to start to do that as we move forward. And I think we've seen this narrative for quite some time now, but the narrative in Web3 tends to be that everyone can be a curator. And by all means, yes, everyone can be a curator. But I think sometimes it also refers to the more narrow scope of the curator as kind of an organizer or a selector. And of course, that is the part of being a curator, but the curator is also much, much wider than just selecting pieces. And then, of course, preservation, and there is, which is super important as we move forward, because there's just so much being released all the time, and just the simple creation of pieces creates the extreme white noise, and it's just absolutely relentless, and it never stops. And of course, within this white noise, released on marketplaces or as art NFTs on own contracts or in any other shape or form for that matter, there are definitely really good and important pieces and projects that should be seen and end up as a part of something that we want to remember. But with all this white noise, there is, of course, also a huge risk that projects of high quality won't be seen, recognized, remembered, or even heard. Things are being forgotten very quickly due to high turnaround of projects, and with so much happening all the time, it's very easy to not consider what we actually want to preserve for the future, what will be remembered in the future, or how are questions that what will be remembered in the future, and how are questions that I feel like we're currently forgetting to ask ourselves from time to time, simply because we always want to be part of the latest thing that's happening. And this is also where I see the curator as someone that's actually very, very important. And this is actually not too dissimilar from what a role would potentially be outside Web3, if you're thinking about the curator from a more traditional point of view. So here I see the curator as someone that's able to identify, that's able to argue for the quality or importance of the work, but also able to present and talk about it in a way that allows for the art and the project to step above that white noise, basically to make sure that this pieces are something that's being pushed forward for the future and for the history of the sector that we work within. And maybe it's easier for the curator to think about these things because it's actually a part of our job to step away from the hype and really consider the pieces and projects for what they are. And of course, this is also because we might have the privilege of time. This is our work. So, I mean, one can only hope that we use this time to actually think about pieces within the sector and why they should be preserved for future generations. And I think maybe as we move forward, the role, well, at least as I see it, will be recognized as a wider role, or that's at least what I hope, not just as a selector. And especially when it comes to new territories such as Web3. There is a lot of translation that needs to happen. The curator can help to facilitate innovation that is considering the history of the art world, the audiences that we are catering to, but also the implementation of new technologies. I see the curator as not only an exhibition facilitator, a content maker, but also a guide that can help steering these new systems together with artists, of course, and maybe help them get into a place where we might find more sustainable innovation that supports bigger ecosystems and not just the individual. So this quote is by the Brazilian educator and philosopher Paulo Freire. And I find this quote quite suiting. I know that he's not referring to curation here, but he actually talking about building new system and more specifically new systems for the oppressed. Discovering cannot be purely intellectual, but must involve action, nor can it be limited to mere activism, but must include serious reflection. Only then will it be praxis. So curation is not a simple streamlined practice of selecting or organizing it. It never has been, or I don't think it ever will be, but it's actually more complex one. And it's certainly evolving as we speak. I think context, activism, and reflection are hugely important and something that the curator needs to be aware of. And I actually do think that this is super important for curators within Web3, crypto, blockchain. We need to consider communities and the depth of what we have within the industry, but we also are keen to push new systems. So there's a lot of things that we need to take into consideration to make this a valid practice. So then to think about it a little bit from URL versus IRL, so to say. What is the difference here, and what do we need to consider? I'm bringing in a little bit of exhibition design and exhibition thinking here because I still think that this is very important because, of course, making exhibitions, as I said, is a huge part of being a curator. Yeah. I think we are in a very interesting times right now because until quite recently, the existence has been mainly online. We have seen a lot the last few years kind of moving out of the online space and into to a more physical space. But it's also the other way around, actually, because huge parts of the traditional art world moved online all of a sudden. And this, of course, was due to COVID. But the benefit of Web3 is that the industry is natively digital. So we already had a huge crowd that was extremely comfortable with spending their time on the internet. Being online is nothing new, but it's just actually an extension of their life. But before anything, I think it's important to mention that neither new media or digital art exhibitions online or in real life is something new. It has a very, very rich history and practice. And I would love to go really into depth with this, but we frankly don't have the time. And I'm not necessarily the right person for this. But just to cover a little bit, so just across the bridge from Copenhagen, where I am, in the Swedish area known as Skåne, we actually have an extremely rich history of digital art with pioneers such as Charlotte Johannesson. This is actually quite not really known, but Skåne was very early on in terms of actually pushing digital art as a practice within the wider art practice. Charlotte was born in 1943 in Malmö, and she's still a practicing artist. She was included in last year's Venice Biennale, which was super excited. She originally worked with weaving, but she changed her loom for an Apple II Plus in 1978, and from there she taught herself coding. The images that you see here are from her solo exhibition at Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid, in Spain. But besides that, Skåne also had an art festival called Electrohype, and it was only dedicated to digital and electronic art. It was quite big here. Please bear in mind that the Nordic scene is small, so what we consider big here might be tiny elsewhere. But this festival ran for about 20 years, from the early 1990s until the 2000s. But unfortunately, they shut down. So what you see here is an installation shot from one of the festivals. And this is also another installation shot from the festival. So to just bring it a little bit back where we are now, and maybe how we need to consider, or what we need to consider when we build exhibitions. So I'm a huge favor of moving beyond the screen. The screen is a tool that we use to facilitate art, but the exhibition itself needs to build a narrative which reaches beyond the screen. We want to tell the story of the pieces that we have included. So to give you an example, is an exhibition at ACA, the Australian Centre of Contemporary Art in Melbourne, which is an exhibition that I saw in January last year, and it was called Who's Afraid of Public Space? It was about the new phase of public art in Australia and how public art could exist within the dialogue of the very problematic history that Australia has, at the same time as it opens up for new dialogues, new narratives around Australia's contemporary history, which is also very, very important to remember. This particular section of the exhibition that you see here was called Project Space to Hoarding, and was realized by an agency called Sibling Architecture. But what I find super fascinating with this is the use of material and the way the digital pieces and narrative is actually echoed and emphasized by the space that has been created around them. Screens, by all means, to show it, but there is more to it. There's also a narrative around everything that's been put in this space. So everything that's in there has a very intentional place. It tells something else that kind of emphasizes the narrative of this specific room. So basically, I think we need to think concept as a way where we can use technology to bridge the digital world with the physical world. For this, we need both elements, of course, both the digital and physical. And I think maybe that the last slide showed a version of that is trying to get there. What I want to point out in the image from the previous slide is the narrative, the story that's being presented, not only the pieces, but actually there's the narrative. So to go back to this one, it was actually about public spaces in Australia. And one thing that was pointed out by my husband, who you can see in the picture, who is Australian, is that there was lots of pieces in here that was talking about kind of developments of public spaces, cornered off spaces, etc. So it kind of emphasized the feeling of a public space for him. It was about something very material, but it doesn't mean that we can learn from it. And maybe we also need to consider pieces like this as we move forward with our exhibitions in real life. Basically, how can we further the narrative? Sometimes we might need to add props, and sometimes maybe we don't. So what I want to point out here is, I want to point out that this kind of ties back to reflection again, which I mentioned before. So for me, reflecting and understanding is incredibly important. And I think maybe we need to get a little bit better at that as we move forward. And of course, one thing here that is important and good for us to do is to know the history, to have the conversations, both with artists and, of course, also technologists and developers. So I think, reflecting upon and understanding the narrative is key for us when it comes to curating within Web3. I also want to briefly touch upon something that I find absolutely fascinating and extremely interesting, which again ties into exhibitions and exhibition design. That is, of course, the experimental layout versus more traditional layouts online. So for this, I'm looking a little bit more at specific exhibition layouts in the recent iteration of Web3. And some of them are actually very relevant for Web3. I'm not going to go into Second Life because I think that's quite happened already, and that again is a completely different discussion. But I think it's still worth mentioning that Second Life had, of course, very early on galleries, museums, etc., which echoed a very real scenario of basically life that we see it and live in it. So quite early on in the pandemic, I think we actually saw a little bit more experimentation when it came to showing art online. New Art City popped up, and they offered some exhibitions that took a step away from the more conventional layout. One of those is Eat Me by Alice Joan Chung. This exhibition was more like a travel or a movement through a red room or void. It was as if you were floating in thin air while someone read out directions, such as the one that you can see in the image. There is nothing you need to do in this very moment, including moving through this space. You simply went along for the ride. This exhibition is still up, I believe. So you should be able to visit it and enjoy the ride. I think this was actually one of the better experiments because actually you couldn't really do much. You could basically just float along. Moving within these spaces is potentially one of the complications that we see because it's hard. It's hard when you're on a screen and trying to move through a space that's actually not physical is extremely complicated, which is also why this experimentation was one of the better ones. But as we moved further into the metaverse or Web3 or whatever we decide to call it, we did see more traditional reactions to spaces and elements that we are familiar with. We saw walls, we saw floors, we saw windows, we saw doors. We even saw the white cube again, which I think quite a few people said that we shouldn't move into. But here we are and we still see it. I wanted to show another example, which is from Museum of Crypto Art, also known as MoCA. I am not entirely sure how up to date this image is, to be honest, but this is what the space looked like, I believe, a year ago. They have their museum in Somnium space. And even though this is somewhat experimental because there are no walls and the art appears to be hanging in thin air, it still has quite traditional architectural features, floors, etc. And it's nothing negative about that, but I think it needs to be highlighted. It is, even though it's experimental, it's still very traditional. So why is this then that we saw and we still see more traditional approach when it comes to showing art in Web3 and Metaverse? Why do we kind of tend to recreate spaces, very physical spaces, when actually we could potentially go in and do exactly what we want to do, just as with this one here, when we can go in and create basically whatever we want? Well, there's actually two very good reasons for this, which aren't really connected to the art, but to the audiences that we might want to bring into the spaces, which of course is something that's extremely important to consider as well when you are a curator. So one of them is onboarding. If we create spaces that people are able to recognize, it's actually more likely that they might want to join as they see it as something that they are familiar with. It will be, to put it frankly, be less scary as a result, also easier for them. I do think that this is really important to remember, because we are talking about a wider reach. We are talking about adaptation. We are talking about reaching new audiences. And if we actually mean it, then we should also practice as we preach, aka make it as easy as possible for people to take part in it. Traditional layout also indicate social values and accepted behavior. If the space looks like real life, then that must mean that you behave the way you behave in real life as well. We all know that quite a lot of people seem to have a hard time to behave properly on the internet. So actually implying social values and accepted behavior by design seems to be something that's really important at this very age as we move forward. I also think that these structures that we see, the imitations of real-life museums, indicate that these spaces are exactly that, new museums, like the new big ones, the new big players when it comes to this. They are the museums of the future, and they are on the same level as the ones that we have in real life. But I also want to say that I also think that limited imagination plays a little bit of a role here. There are very few humans that are capable of coming up with things that aren't remotely related to the world that we are living in. We can always imagine things and scenarios, but in many cases, when you actually think about it, these imaginations have some kind of relation to the physical world in one way or another. There is something in them that is directly drawn from where we live. And having these limitations isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's only what it means to be a human. And when it comes to these limitations, the beautiful thing is also that we can actually collaborate to get beyond them. We have, of course, also platforms such as JPEG, which opens up for more specific curation tailored towards NFTs. So just to read out their statement, JPEG allows everyone to create NFT exhibitions regardless of what they own. Flexible layouts allow users to bring attention and value to NFTs through context-focused viewing experiences and new complementary meanings. They have collaborated with quite a few more traditional players, such as Art Brussels, Office Impart, Panka Gallery, and they are now also actually releasing NFTs, but that's something else. So the still that you see here is from a joint exhibition between Office Impart and Panka Gallery. It included artists such as Han van den Droppel, Jonas Lund, Cornelia Solfrank, Rafael Rosendahl, Ria Meyers, Latuba Avedon, and Kim Asendorf. The exhibition was called NFT Net Art and was published last year, I believe. And all exhibitions that are published on their site is also on-chain, which means that they are recorded on the blockchain And I guess you can argue that this kind of archives exhibitions in a somewhat of a secure way, I guess. They have a slightly more traditional website approach. I think they have 3 different layouts. Some are very straightforward, and some are set out to be a bit more museum-esque. They've also launched what they call JPEG canons, which is a community-curated NFT list, and categories such as such as on-chain, crypto, social, aesthetic, and conceptuality. This again is kind of a decentralized way of organizing lists and curation, and just make it easier to find NFTs again within this white noise. But we are also starting to see players from a more art-heavy background, and that they are starting to entering the space when it comes to displaying art, digital art online. Node, which is launched in May, so yeah, this month, is a platform by Berlin-based gallery Office Import, and I think it's actually launching in 2 weeks. And their first showcase is going to be by Copenhagen-based artist Ada, who's working with generative art. I haven't really seen any of the layouts of the space yet, but Office Import is a gallery that thinks about curation in basically everything they do. So I would be very, very surprised if they don't take this into consideration when launching Node as well. So these are just some different alternatives: New Art, City, Mocha, JPEG, and Node by Office Import. They all have different ways of doing it online, and there is no right answer or no right way of doing it. But I think actually we need to, what we need to do when we pick the layout for an online exhibition is that we need to consider the aim of the exhibition, the experience that's being presented, just to mention a few things. And I think that even though we sometimes try to find a one-size-fits-all kind of solution and answer when it comes to current developments, that this is the right way of doing it, that's never going to work. It's much more complicated than that. And I think all these 4 examples are great in terms of actually highlighting different functions and different options as we move forward and different ways of doing it. And I really hope that we see more of these kind of experimentations in the future, maybe as hybrids, but also existing on their own right. So I'm going to circle back now to the notion and the idea of the curator and curation. So where are we now, and where might we be going then? I think, as I mentioned before, and I mentioned quite a few times throughout this presentation, that I think we're at a point where reflection and long-term thinking needs to be 2 things that we just do by default. We just need to do it. We can't have an excuse of not doing this actually any longer. And because for so long we've seen just endless projects, endless minting, very little consideration, a lot of blind innovation, solutionism without conversation, and that's frankly not really getting us anywhere. It might be excited for a minute or 2, but I don't think it's moving us forward. I think it just makes us stand in the same spot, just kind of not going anywhere. And if anywhere, just a very short distance. So if we are serious about this industry as a whole, then reflection, translation, consideration, contextualization, long-term thinking will be key to create these foundations that the ecosystem can stand upon and grow upon as well. So where does the curator then fit in within this narrative? To bring it back to where I started, where the word curation comes from, the meaning of care and concern. And the care and concern that we are talking about is not only a simple act of caring. The caring is not always simple, I know that. But for me, it's a much wider term. So the act of caring is there, but I think it also means the act of reflecting, the act of translating, the act of contextualization, the act of long-term thinking, the act of facilitating, the act of considering, the act of trusting, the act of whatever word that might fit within this space. Thank you very much. And now it's time for Q&A.
I have a question if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much for the presentation. That was lovely to hear. I was hoping you could maybe speak about how you perceive the difference between curation and gatekeeping, and why do people sometimes confuse the two?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting term. I think, yeah. So for a really long time, when I said I was a curator in this space, people very quickly jumped to accusing me for gatekeeping, which by all means I've never done. I've never seen it as anything that I've done. But I think it comes down to the simple fact of a selection process, which I mean, it sucks sometimes, but that's just kind of what life is like. I mean, even if you're looking at the vertical crypto residency that you're in now, there's a selection process going on there as well. And I think people kind of gets it from there that curation has been perceived as a selection process. And because there's a selection process to it, that also means that there's a term of gatekeeping. I hope that answered your question.
It does. I appreciate it. I think the reason why I asked is because I see often get confused, and I think it's part of this broader idea that we should get rid of all hierarchy, right? But in some ways, there's hierarchies that are based on competence, and there's based on other selection parameters, and they're not necessarily exclusive, but sometimes they are, and they have to be by nature. So thanks.
Oh, 100% agree with you. I think it's hierarchy is sometimes bad, hierarchy is sometimes good. And I mean, there is a selection process, like you said, to nature. And I think, yes, of course, curation can be gatekeeping, but I don't think if curation is done in the right way, I don't think curation is actually gatekeeping, but rather a more thoughtful process around preservation, long-term thinking, and kind of thinking about how a space can evolve, where artists can also be pushed forward in narratives and in spaces where that serves their practices as well.
Thank you so much.
Emily, I see that you mentioned that you have a question. Please go ahead.
Yes, hi. First of all, thank you for such an interesting presentation. So much I didn't know. My question's about your involvement with traditional IRL galleries. What do you feel is the sentiment right now? Here in New York, Pace is very much on board, but you don't see a lot more galleries sort of flooding in. I'd love to know what you think of that, what's happening now, and also long-term thinking, how you see traditional galleries moving into the space. What are their main concerns? What's holding them back?
That's a really interesting question. I think it's one of the parts I think that's important to mention is that there's always been I don't necessarily separate Web3, NFT, blockchain art from kind of digital art. I see that as a new extension of the practice. So I think there you kind of need to raise the idea of this being quite limited in terms of audiences that's interested, unfortunately. However, that being said, I think with blockchain, NFTs, etc., the audiences has grown immensely within the last few years. Jan Robert Lechte, who's an artist I've worked with, he's worked with internet for a really long time. And when he entered the NFT space, he basically said that he found a community that he never had before. I don't really know in terms of traditional galleries and incentives in terms of getting into this space. I would like to see that if they do get into the space, they have a genuine interest in actually pushing the practices and the artists forward and supporting them when it comes to developing digital art practices. So to answer, I don't know if I can give you a clear answer on how they should get in. I would rather say the ones that goes into the gallery, goes into these kind of spaces. I would want to see a genuine interest and not just kind of for them to see it as a money-making machine, which I know some galleries have and some galleries are still doing. So rather than incentives, I just hope that there's a genuine interest for the ones who move into it. Please go ahead. I see there's a few here after Emily, so please just jump in after.
Great, thank you. Thank you for a great presentation. My question, I guess, is twofold. One, I'd be curious, if this isn't too personal, to know how your sort of professional lens has affected personal choices in terms of collecting. I'm wondering whether being a quote unquote professional curator, which is a bit of a silly term, I guess, whether that helps you sort of scratch that itch, and then you can just sort of get your fix through that path, and then not have that sort of itchiness of collecting and accumulating. And the reason I ask is because I find myself struggling with not so much the white noise you described, which is very, very real, but the sort of data deluge. And I've often found myself collecting something, especially on Tezos, where the price point is quite low, where I'm actually collecting to bookmark, not even the art, sometimes the artist, of course, but often also just sort of like this evolution in the marketplace or a new idea, or, and so I'm not, if you look at my object, it's a frightful mess because it's all there. But it's also like there is a method to the madness, which probably cannot be perceived by anyone else but myself. But there are multiple strategies. And by strategy, I do not mean a financial strategy. I mean really a conversation I'm having with myself and with all of the art about, what it means to be human in this moment, basically. So I understand this is a really big question, but I'm just going to let you chew on it and perhaps share your thoughts with us.
Yes, so I of course do collect art, both in a physical sense but also digitally, because I'm very much a part of the space. But I'm actually not that much of a collector, because a lot of it comes with responsibility as well. And currently, I don't have the time or I would also say some like the actually genuine knowledge like some people in the space have in terms of preserving these pieces. So I am very selective when it comes to curating. I think that you're mentioning collecting for the sake of bookmarking is actually really, really interesting. I haven't even thought of that. But of course, that's a great way in actually terms of remembering things, especially on Tezos, where usually, as you mentioned, the price points are sometimes fairly low. But how my role as I guess I would actually call myself a professional curator, even though it's maybe a little bit silly, comes in terms of collecting. So I only collect pieces that I really, really like. I don't necessarily buy anything for a sake as an investment, though I know that people tend to do that within the space. So rather than actually looking, I guess, actually, no, I am looking at it from a professional point of view, because I do have an extremely hard time to separate my professional self from my own self. But I look at it from the point of view of the pieces that I really like. That being said, of course, all pieces that I include in exhibitions is not always a professional or a personal preference in terms of pieces that I would want to collect or buy, but actually pieces as well. That's important. However, the ones I buy are always pieces that I really, really like and don't intend to sell for the future. I hope that answers your questions a bit.
It does. Thank you for sharing. I find that I don't buy for speculative reasons, but I do collect very broadly. And then there are all these other sort of aspects that are commingled with that decision-making process. And it's also about, as an artist, it's also about supporting other artists too. So that there are all these different motivations. And I was just interested to hear your own position. Thank you so much for sharing.
Of course.
Hello, it's Jerry here from Sungrazers. There were a couple of things occurred to me while you were speaking, and thank you, Stina. That was far more stimulating than I expected the conversation to be. It was fantastic. One is that as creators of the moving image, sound is a big issue for us. And it has come to the fore when you get this juxtaposition between the URL and the IRL. In the URL, it's actually much easier to deal with, much easier to access a piece of moving image that has sound with it, in our case usually music, because you are a singleton in your own environment with control over that audio scenario, whereas in the IRL, it's really hard to deal with. We had an IRL exhibition a couple of months ago, and how to deal with the sound is difficult, because if you've got multiple pieces, you can't have them all playing at the same time. You've got to somewhat isolate the person either with headsets, which is not great in a time of COVID, or isolate them with some other form of museum technology where you're standing under a dome of sound or whatever. So that has stretched us in terms of how we, in terms of what we create, and in the context of curation, I suspect has an effect on the curator. And part of the same subject, I guess, you were talking about onboarding people and how the Web3 spaces tend to look a bit like real life, and you listed limited imagination as being one of those things. I would argue with that slightly, because we're very engaged with onboarding people, largely because the majority of collectors, if they're not other artists, then they tend to be older people, because they have the time and they have the money and so on and so on. We have found that if something looks more like a traditional gallery, then there is more success in taking a 70-year-old, for example, which we've done on a couple of occasions with big collectors of ours, in taking them into something which they can. It's not a step too far, you know. It's not a weird place that looks like you're weightless on Mars or something. It's okay, yes, I'm entering something that I'm familiar with, which is an art gallery, but it happens to be online, and we found that that's helpful with onboarding people who are not familiar with Web3. So this juxtaposition between IRL and URL is a fascinating topic, and there isn't really a right or a wrong, is there?
No, absolutely not. And I think this kind of onboarding that you mentioned as well, which I also highlighted, I think you're spot on there, like in terms of actually onboarding people into these new spaces that's being created. It's super important to make it as easy as possible and make it as familiar as possible. I mean, like you said, bringing a collector to like a Mars space is very unlikely that they're gonna be interested in anything. Whereas if it's more a traditional setting, then yes, I mean, it's something that they know, it's something that they're comfortable with, and potentially also then comfortable with actually buying pieces. So yes, I think 100% you're absolutely right with that. In terms of sound and IRL exhibitions, that is super hard. The exhibition I mentioned that I curated for Konstal, there was 3 pieces in there which had audio to it, 3 videos, it's quite an open space, and of course, there's something you need to work very closely with the artists to make sure that they're happy about it. That it's not overpowering one or another, that you can actually hear the other one. So of course, this is definitely something that is very much a part of my job as a curator when it comes to curating exhibitions in physical spaces. And this is also why, for me, it's so extremely important to have the conversations with the artists that I am exhibiting, because they will also know how they want to show their pieces, and it's them allowing me to show their pieces. There's also trust that comes in. There's, of course, I need to make sure that they're comfortable with how their piece is being displayed.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I must apologise for being croaky. It's 3:00 in the morning here in Australia. But I don't know if we're going to hear from guys from Arium Spaces later in the residency. I know they have done in the past. It's been fascinating with the amount of effort they have put into the sound environment, so that it is a one-to-one thing, but it also recognises that a Web3 metaverse is a shared space. So the closer you get to a piece of art, the more you can hear it, and in that way, it has the other advantage that everybody else in the space isn't listening to the same sound. I've been really impressed how much effort they've put into that, and it's helped us a lot in the creation of our Arium spaces. But thank you again, Stina. Really stimulating discussion.
Thank you so much, and thank you for showing up to my presentation that early. I very, very, very much appreciate that. Evelyn, please go ahead.
Hi. First, I want to say nice to meet a fellow Swede in this space. And
nice to meet you.
and I curated a show at Larsen Warner Gallery in Stockholm, which is on right now. And we have also another show, the one after. So that's a trad art gallery doing. Trying to, I mean, it's very hard because it's you want to onboard people, but it's people have no clue from the beginning, so you have to start from scratch and give people something that is they can draw a line from what the gallery usually show, which is paintings and stuff. So the reference point is quite different. So then I had to do just show things that I thought was a good entry point for people. And one artist here is also in the show, which is Nominal, which is nice. And my question was more, is there any, this is a personal question because this is only Sweden, but is there any Swedish institutions that support kind of the digital arts and crypto art and stuff like that one can do stuff together with, and sort of?
There is not one that's particularly kind of concentrating on this very particular thing, as far as I'm aware of. I mean, there is a bit of experimentation going on. I don't know if you know that Statens Konstråd did their Statens Konstråd is like the public association, art association in Sweden. They did an experimentation in terms, I'm just explaining to the other ones so that they know as well, but they did a public piece with NFTs last year. So there is experimentation like that. I do know as well that there is interest. So, for example, Kristianstad Konsthall, the symposium that we had in March was kind of opening up around networks within the museum world, etc., in terms of actually having more conversations with the digital spaces. So there's a movement, but as far as I know, there isn't really anyone that's specifically working with this. However, I do hope that changes quite quickly. And I am trying to facilitate as many conversations as I possibly can in terms of onboarding museums, galleries, etc., and kind of showing that there is more to the space than Bored Apes, which sadly quite a few actually really jump into quite quickly when you mention digital art or NFTs or crypto, etc. So I don't want to disappoint you. There is no one specifically, but I think there's interest and movement, and I hope that we'll see more within the Nordics the coming years.
Yes, hopefully. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Anton, I think you say here that you have a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you for amazing presentation. It's really was for me interesting to know about curation. And my question is, what is the process of artist and curator meeting each other? So, and what would you advise for artist from a white noise? How could artists reach out and find good, interesting curator or interesting project to be able to take part in it? I'm interested in this one.
Of course. So the first question in terms of the process, so this is, now I'm going to be speaking a little bit from like my own point of view in terms of how I work, because of course there is not universal way of how a curator works. It's very individual. The terms of like how I usually work when it comes to exhibition is that I will do research and from there kind of pick artists, though that now sounds very selective, but of course, like I said before, there is a selection process to my work. And yeah, so my work is very heavily research based. So that's kind of, for me, that's the process between the artist and the curator, is that I will do research around the narrative, concept, whatever kind of path my exhibition take, and from there have conversations with artists. That being said, though, conversations with artists for me doesn't always happen in terms of actually with an exhibition. I regularly do studio visits, etc., with artists as well, where I kind of follow their process in terms of how they develop their practices. I don't always contact an artist with the intent of including them in an exhibition right now. However, I guess this is a little bit in terms of actually bookmarking. So for me, studio visits is also about bookmarking pieces and artists and kind of keep them in mind for future exhibitions and developments, text, etc. In terms of your other questions, in terms of taking a step above the white noise, I think what you're doing right now, participating in the residency, is exactly that. I think you currently have a perfect opportunity to have conversations with people like myself. I am also a one-on-one mentor for this program, so I'm happy to kind of have conversations with all of you one-on-one as well. So I think just participating in programs like this is an absolutely great step in the right direction in terms of ending up in front of curators and other people within the space that might help you to push your practice forward.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Afrosco, please go ahead. I see that you have one as well.
Hey, first of all, thanks for a great presentation. I really learned a lot listening in. My question is, I guess, a two-part question. I had the opportunity last year to show some work at the Venice Biennale, and I was one of the artists representing Ghana, the Ghana Pavilion. And part of what I showed was a combination of, I'll say, different technologies and processes And one of them had to do with the 1,024 drawings that I did and trained a machine learning algorithm on. And the story kind of flowed into a virtual reality experience where I showed some NFTs in VR as part of the story I was trying to tell. But one thing I noticed was a lot of it kind of went over people's heads quite a bit. And it was for me great to be part of this movement and representing it in this traditional art space. Because as far as I knew, we were the first pavilion to do something like that, where we showed NFTs in VR and whatnot. But I'll say the response made me question whether it was too soon or we should have gone with something more traditional. I had my story to tell, so I insisted on this. So that's the first question. Was it in moving with new media and digital technology and how it evolves? Artists are always kind of at the forefront. Can it be considered as too soon to sort of push tech into these spaces? And the second question is, and part of what I found is, I was selected by a curator to be part of this show. However, their experience is not necessarily along these tech-driven lines. And so perhaps maybe the importance of such a moment where Ghana is doing this thing was not as appreciated as it could have been. And so how do artists find better alignment with curators who understand these movements and can help represent their work a lot better?
Well, first and foremost, congratulations on being included in showing in the Venice Biennale. That's huge. So, no, to your first question, no, I don't think it's too early. I think it's brilliant to be included in something like this, even if it's not necessarily something that's used to more kind of tech heavy scenario. No, I don't think it's too early at all. I think it's actually sometimes, even though you don't wish it to go over people's head, but sometimes that's actually necessary to kind of shake up scenarios, and that also doesn't have to be something negative. That can also be something that's being remembered as pushing the boundaries. And to answer your second questions, it's always really tough. A relationship between a curator and an artist is very much kind of a give and take scenario. For me, it's always a lot about an extreme trust scenario. And if you feel that wasn't right for you, I'm very sorry to hear that. But of course, it's also humans involved, and relationships aren't always easy. But as an artist as well, even though it's tough for a new artist to be selective in terms of how they want to do things, you are, of course, allowed to be selective and also voice your opinions in terms of when things aren't right. For me, the conversation between the curator and artist is extremely important, because in that way we can help you and support you in terms of actually showing your vision and showing your pieces in the right way. That being said, though, as I said, the way a curator works is extremely individual, and not everyone works like that. I don't want to paint myself as an angel, but for me, the conversation between an artist and a curator is kind of what's at the core for any kind of collaboration and exhibition that I do. So I don't really, again, know if I have one answer. I could maybe just have, advice in terms of if something doesn't feel right, you are absolutely, you have the right to voice it. And you also have the right to say no if you feel that this is not anything that you would want to participate in. I hope that helps a little bit.
That's helpful. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? it seems like there's no more questions.
Any last questions, guys? If there aren't any other questions, I'm going to say thank you so much to Stina for her amazing presentation. Thank you so much for lifting the veil off of such a complicated topic sometimes. And I see that there are people who are writing. Just let's wait to see if there is another question coming in.
Of course, I also saw that someone requested the link to the report. I'm happy to share them. Actually, let me get them up in right now, and I'll share them in the chat as well. If you bear with me 1 second, that will give people a little bit more time. Let's see. So this is the report to the first one. I hope it works. And then we got the report to the second, or the link to the second one as well. Amanda, when you say handle, do you mean Twitter? 1 sec, I'll share that as well. There you go. There's my Twitter. Well, thank you for everyone that listened in. I'm glad it seemed like you liked it. Like I mentioned before, I'm also a one-on-one mentor. So if you have any more specific questions about your own practices, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, Stina.